Okay, in this module, we're going to be talking a little bit about culture and what it is. And actually, I think everybody knows a little bit about what culture is, the culture to not culture or something like that. But on a scientific level and as a sociological level, it's very difficult to define culture. It's not quite a very simple task. So we need to know a little bit about the meaning of what the culture is, how we describe it, what are the factors which go into it, and how does it change? I mean, what do you have to do in order to be part of a particular culture? Do you have to speak the language? Do you have to eat the food? If you eat some of the food and not the other food? If you grew up as a Korean American, and you go back to Korea, are you Korean or an American? If you're going, these are the questions which we need to look and to address in order to understand what culture is. And one of the most basic ideas, of course, is culture and all those factors which define the culture occur within a society. Okay, which is a group of interacting people. Any society, it could be a small society, large societies are not necessarily the whole country, but it is a group of people who share and pass on cultural strategies for dealing with something and responding to what's going on in their surroundings. In other words, if and a very real level, the culture that we talk about, it could be a culture or a subculture or whatever it is. We got to there, or we can define those things as culture within that society. So that's the first idea. What you have to know: the societies are those group of people who understand how to deal with things in certain manners. Okay, so let's say, what are those certain manners? Well, again, let's go back and say that's the culture. So the culture will be then the blueprint for deciding what is the proper way of behaving, the proper way of sending cultural messages, sending messages across from one person to another. And there are certain aspects which you have to look at in culture in order to define it. I'm going to bring here 7 different aspects, okay? And these are that they've learned. There's that culture is learned, culture is shared, culture is patterned, culture is mutually constructed, culture is symbolic, culture is arbitrary, and culture is internalized. Let's go over those one by one, so that maybe we can learn and share them further on, and maybe we will be a society of sociologists. Well, probably not, but at any rate, it's something which is learned. In other words, we're not born with the culture. Children, babies were born with the need to eat. Most infants actually have milk for breakfast. That might not be part of the culture. As a matter of fact, I think that most infants eat, mammalian infants across species have milk for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the first period of their life. But what about having milk and cereal for breakfast? Now that's something which is learned. If you're an adult and you eat milk and cereal for breakfast, well, that's part of your culture. What about having milk and orange juice for breakfast? Well, in some places milk is not that available, so why don't you have it with orange juice? Is there anything wrong with that? Yeah, that's not what you do. But that's because it's your culture. And some people believe milk is only good for infants. But as an adult, you might have milk and cereal for breakfast. So that is something which you learned as an adult. Now, let's say you're the only one around having that milk, and cereal for breakfast. That would mean that, well, what about if you're having milk, your cereal with sour cream? Now, you might have learned that. Is that, however, part of your culture? Well, if you're American, probably you're not having milk and having your cereal with sour cream in the morning. There's nothing wrong with it, but you'll know that this is not part of the shared culture. They have to be patterned. Patterns change, of course, but we'll talk about that. I know when years ago, when I was growing up, for instance, everybody ate dinner at 6 o'clock. Children went to sleep at 7:30. So much so that in the television programs, because there were only like 5 television stations in any major metropolitan area, 5 or 7, I don't remember, and that everybody watched in the evening, all children watched, I don't remember if it was Captain Kangaroo or Mickey Mouse show, whatever it was, but at the end of the show, they said, and now it's time for most of you children to go to bed. Because it was time for most of the children to go to bed. Because it was something which is a pattern throughout the society. We know that we normally have, for instance, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But not everybody has breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Not actually everybody in the United States has breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because dinner is the meaning of the large meal of the day. And so rural farmers on small farms will probably have dinner, lunch, and supper, because they've gotten up and had worked a long time. So then they get up and have their large meal in the beginning of the day, and then they have lunch and supper. But it's a pattern which goes throughout the culture. So they have a subculture which is slightly different. Furthermore, it's mutually constructed. Mutually constructed throughout through a process of social interaction. And it's symbolic, it means something. The cultural items can have a particular meaning. Like, for instance, you take a towel. Now, a towel can be used for drying yourself. But, for instance, in Korea, towels aren't really necessarily used for drying oneself. They're used for scrubbing oneself. So you give a person a towel, you're assuming you're giving a person because they're going in to take a shower. And they take showers differently also, which is another story which we'll talk about. So it's symbolic. Also, what we might be saying as symbols. For instance, you know, how's your meal going? Pretty good, huh? A-okay, right? Do this in South America, and you're likely to get thrown out of the the restaurant, because that symbol means some part of the human anatomy, which we don't talk about. But of course that leads on to the idea of being arbitrary. Nothing which it's not really have a necessarily particular rational idea that has to be connected to it. I mean, we call a door, but the word door is an English word saying that it means that something that you go in and out of. In Hebrew, the word door means generation. A generation is not something you go in and out. You stay in that generation from the time you're born until the time you die. So it's arbitrary. Other things, standards of beauty. We know that people think that things are beautiful differently in different places, whether light skin or dark skin, whether tattoos or no tattoos, long hair or short hair, skinny or thin, or not thin. All these are arbitrary and seems to change over time. But even more so, regardless of what it is, we get this to be internalized. We know that this is right because this is right for our society. It can't be any other way. What do you mean? An overweight woman is pretty? How could you say such a thing? That makes no sense at all. Or eating a steak for breakfast, doesn't make sense. Well, or garlic for breakfast. You're going to ruin your stomach. But there are many, many cultures who do eat garlic for breakfast. Because after all, eating garlic at the nighttime is going to leave the taste in your mouth overnight. But we wouldn't do that. But it really makes no real sense. All these other things are possible. So that's the basic idea, a basic idea that we have in the in culture itself. Let's see further. That's a basic definition we have in culture. Now there are, for instance, particulars in the culture. Each culture has its own particular way of looking at things. But on the other hand, there are also universals, things that we have in common across all cultures. And we have to look at those things, and where those things separate is how we're going to define the culture. One particular idea that I'd like to mention here is the idea of social emotions. Now, emotions don't necessarily mean that they have to be defined on a sociological level. Certainly we look at that in a psychological level and a biological level. We can define, there's something that seems to go inside of us. But to get a complete picture, we might want to look at the sociological perspective. And there are 4 ideas that we can apply to social emotions that might be helpful to give an additional perspective to what we might think of the emotions of happiness, love, fear, and things like that. Because although we know that they are internal and we can discuss it on a psychological, let's look at it for a minute from these 4 ideas on a sociological level. Number 1, the actor's definition and interpretations are essential for understanding the conduct. In other words, the way I understand your expression of emotion and the way I understand my expression of emotion is important for us to understand what the emotion and the emotional expression is. And that is influenced by the society. Okay, so we're going to look at those aspects of society, how it impinges upon the way I look and see and understand the emotion. Number 2, the human behavior is emergent. It develops. As it is going, it changes. It changes as you express it. There's been times when you start expressing one emotion and it turns over to another and it turns over to another, depending upon the interactional communication system and the environment which is going on. Number 3, actions are influenced by the people's internal states. And this is all influenced by the external events and stimuli and
the actor's perceptions and interpretations. All this, right, is shaped by the internal and external focus. So you can be focused differently, and what's going to affect your focus, and your focus on your internal effects and the internal impulses on your external events and external focuses, and your focus will change according to what you perceive as more important to be focused upon. And the fourth matter that needs to be taken into account are the social structures, such as culture, systems, roles, etc. In other words, person's not only his culture itself, but the system which he's in. For instance, if you're going to be in a business setting as against a religious setting, and the roles that a person has in it. For instance, a person who will look upset and he's the boss in a business meeting will have a very different emotional interpretation than if he was an underling. So all these determine, all these things will give a framework for the ability to express those emotions. And these are the social aspects of emotions. It doesn't determine the behavior, but it certainly will shape it and give it a proper way of understanding all of these factors. And that'll give us a broad indication of the definitions of culture that can be used in sociology.